Okay, good morning and welcome to the final of the webinar briefings run by the Media Centre for Education Research Australia for 2020. It's definitely been an unusual year in education and elsewhere, and today we've brought together a panel of some of the most eminent researchers from around Australia to talk about how this has affected education, both on an individual level and on a systemic level. Today we have Professor Deb Bateman from Flinders University, Professor Andrew Martin from UNSW, Associate Professor Elspeth McGuinness from UniSA, and Dr. Emily Berger from Monash University, who will be speaking to these issues. There'll be a time for people to ask questions at the end, and we will ask people to either ask them in the text box or by raising their hands. And can people please also stay on mute while they're not speaking. Our first speaker today is Professor Deb Bateman from Flinders University. Deb.
Sorry. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Kaurna land, pay my respect to elders past and present. 2020 has highlighted our need to be adaptive, resilient, and open to change in response to things that are outside the scope of our control. We're learning on the fly, we're adapting to a series of events and changes that were just not imagined. This year has issued a series of challenges to rethink who we are in the world individually, in relation to others, collectively, and to reimagine every aspect of our lives. This is a significant moment as we rethink the uncertainties of future outbreaks, the consequences of those, broader disruptions, and how we prepare our young people to live in such turbulence or to establish new normals. This is a time to rethink the infrastructure that enables an outstanding education for every learner. 2020 has disrupted the stories, the symbols, the rites, the rituals that we rely upon to manage change in our lives. We've been forced to rethink what matters. We've shown great adaptability, but yet there are many aspects in these times which we're yet really to understand the consequences of or to really know. Examples are things such as a whole generation of little people who have not yet started school in the way that they ought to have. Many cohorts of young people have foregone the usual rites and passages of transition to lives post-school. Millions of parents have come to appreciate the work and expertise of teachers and of principals, and to appreciate the sophistication of young people's learning and what they know and how they know. A whole generation of teachers trained in an analog era have taken a digital leap into online learning. Heavily regulated training organisations, professional accreditation bodies have discovered a whole range of new flexibilities to really focus on what matters in continuing our professions. The value of ATAR or Year 12 scores have decreased in significance in considering entrance to vocational and academic pathways. The significance or the recognition of the need to look after our own and increase our partnership and responsibilities to and for our rural, remote, regional and Indigenous communities is front of mind. Discussions of what constitutes essential or non-essential work has challenged how we think about the possible roles, aspirations and status, and as a result of COVID consequences, jobs and businesses that have always been considered stable and secure are being re-evaluated. There are seemingly also less resources available to achieve educational goals and aspirations of states, territories, and nations. So, if we're wise, this is a moment to reimagine, renew, and reset our collective values, appreciation, and aspirations, commitment and resources that position education in its broadest sense as the greatest enabler and mobiliser, which will enable us to grow and thrive in a post-COVID world. Education throughout time has been shaped by and responds to revolutions and disruptions. Our current way of thinking about schools, learning, universities, pathways, training, and workforces of future generations remain strongly situated in the past, and it's time to pivot. In the Western world, our continued reproduction of the same beliefs and knowledge forms have also continued to create tensions between the aspiration for and of learners and the agency of young people in changing worlds. which are in contrast to the metrics and measures masked as accountabilities that detract from more innovative thinking and actions required to bravely explore diversified futures. Never before will we have experienced the multi-generational demands on educational infrastructure as we will now in these coming times. The need to revisit what previous scholars have referred to as a new basics in school curriculum for changing and unknown times. The impetus to include increased futures literacy, or the ability to unpack probable, possible, and even implausible futures, and to enable our young people to really explore and develop their pathways, to aspire, to shape, to contribute to constructing their worlds. Our responsibility has increased to consider much stronger and diversified and streamlined pathways between and amongst all of our educational infrastructure and institutions that enable the growth of new mindsets, innovative workforces, and address the needs of communities and people where they are and whoever they are. And of course, now we have this consideration of a scale to respectfully and at pace re-engage, retrain, and reorient our dislocated and disrupted workforces. If, as it has been suggested, the resources are less, but the impetus and the demand for education is greater, we must direct those available resources to where they will make the greatest difference, not within increased levels of bureaucracy or superficial campaign initiatives, but to our educational institutions, staff, and allied learning support services, be they early childhood settings, schools, vet, TAFE providers, or universities. This is a time for great, strong, and very courageous educational leadership. We've seen it rise during this year. We've seen how much education matters. Out of 2020, we must all make great choices. We can all contribute to the reshaping of our country and nation. We can be brave in exploring and responding to the images of the future that lay before us, or we can continue to bury our collective heads in the grand narratives of an educational history which has not served all people or all communities. The legacy of our last educational revolution in Australia has been league tables and many metrics which no longer seem to matter nearly as much. So let's begin our post-COVID educational reset with courage, integrity, and a sense of community. Let's think about the students, the learners, the diversity, what it means to be an educational expert, what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a leader in education. Let's think about our changing world, and moreover, how we look for and expect the very best from our educational infrastructure to build great Australian futures for all. Thank you very much for your listening to my reflection on the year. I'd now like to pass to Andrew Martin from the University of New South Wales. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Deb, and welcome everyone, and thanks for tuning in, whether you're in real-time live or you're listening to a recording. I'm coming from Gadigal land, and I thank all Gadigal people, past, present and future, for having me here. I guess I'm an educational psychologist, and my area of research is student motivation. And I think certainly COVID has raised concerns about students' literacy and numeracy, and these so-called, these hard skills and basic skills, and for good reason. There are concerns there that need to be addressed. As a motivation researcher, I see other dimensions of students' schooling also affected. And so early data that we're seeing and communication with colleagues who have been collecting data through the year have shown that important attitudes and orientations to school and schooling have also been affected. Motivation is one of those areas, and there are numerous parts to motivation. So it includes, on the positive side, it includes students self-confidence, their learning focus, persistence, and so on. And also on the darker side, it includes fear of failure, anxiety, and so on. The early data we're seeing, and also communications with schools, is that one aspect of motivation is taking a bit of a hit, and that's students' valuing of school. Valuing has numerous parts. And so one aspect of valuing is how much students enjoy what they're doing. It's interesting, it arouses curiosity, it's fun to do. So that's one aspect of valuing. Another aspect of valuing is what we call utility or usefulness valuing, and that is schools, the extent to which school is useful, relevant, connected to my life now, connected to my opportunities down the track. Another aspect of valuing is, in fact, what we call a cost aspect. And so it's when you decide that doing this, for example, listening in class, doing your homework, for various reasons has more upside than doing something else. And so often when we decide to do something or not, we weigh up the cost. If we do this, what are we missing out on for not doing something else? And so as I said, these aspects of valuing have been sort of heading south over the course of this year. Why? Well, for one, there has been significant uncertainty for students, not only for getting through the year, whether they would even do final exams, for example, and many did not, but also what's happening next year. What does university or working life hold for me? And so there's uncertainty about the future. So in some ways, students will think, well, why bother with school if it's not connected to positive futures? One Year 12 student mentioned that Year 12, this year's we've had all the stress and the grind and none of the fun, and so the valuing of school and the interest and enjoyment stakes has taken a hit on that front as well. It's been particularly for teachers and students who have been in remote learning at various parts. Learning is a very social emotional process, and it's harder to connect on those dimensions online. So when students are in the classroom with teachers, they have far greater capacity to arouse curiosity, to arouse interest, to fire up the enjoyment. That's harder online. And then a final reason is it's a term referred to as ego depletion, and there are mixed findings on ego depletion, but it's been weighing on my mind this year with regard to COVID. So ego depletion is when you spend a lot of time with pressure to stay disciplined, to stay in control. Over time, you can actually lose energy and lose control. So, for example, that is often why supermarkets will have the chocolate bars at the counter. You've resisted the temptation the whole way through, and then finally you crack. That's ego depletion, or an example of it. So kids this year, and teachers indeed, and parents, have spent a lot of time having to exert self-control and discipline that in years gone by they haven't. So they've had to, hygiene, social distancing, so much we've had to just be hyper vigilant. And I wonder if there's a depletion of energy on that front, so that when you have to turn around and do your schoolwork, there's not much in the tank. So in 2021, what do we do with regards to valuing? And we need to keep an eye on it next year. First of all, it's important for teachers and schools and parents to be really clear with students, children and young people. There is a future. There are pathways ahead of us. If we're they may be a bit different from what we expected in some cases. And so we need to encourage our kids to be adaptable so we can maintain the utility or usefulness valuing of school. There's a future. With regards to cost, teachers need to be really clear with what is the upside of doing, listening in class or participating in group work and so on. Be really clear that there's greater upside than downside. And that's another way. That's to address the cost aspect of valuing. It's important to pay particular attention wherever possible for teachers to, to look, how can I arouse curiosity? How can I inject a bit of fun and humour in what I'm doing? How can I fire up interest? And so look at the tasks and activities from that perspective to be another way to promote valuing. And then finally, with regard to the ego depletion, understand that next year we may also need to be quite vigilant and disciplined in various ways. And so look for circuit breakers, look for fun activities where kids can relax a little bit. And so you look for ways to energize so that we're mindful that we're not constantly depleting energy. And so in these ways, I believe students valuing of school can get on track next year, and kids can be onwards and upwards from there. And I wish certainly teachers, students and parents all the very best for that. I'm going to now hand over to Associate Professor Elspeth McInnes. She's from the University of South Australia. Welcome, Elspeth.
Thank you, Andrew. And I too would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Ghana lands, and acknowledge and thank our elders and all past, present and emerging. It's been an interesting year, and I want to pick up on the opportunities really, as well as the losses, but to really highlight that we've kind of cracked open that industrial model of schooling that we've carried persistently through the decades, where we sort of have a mass approach to assembling and putting students through learning on a timetable, and that's been really changed and forced into new adaptations by COVID, and it's enabled us to innovate. It's enabled us to try new things, to learn new things, to find out successes and failures. And I think the significance of schools to children's learning, but also to the wider economic activity, was emphasised in the drive politically to make sure that schools were open, and teachers and educators were really on the front lines through the peak of lockdowns and this whole process of adaptation. And another aspect of the provision of free childcare for a period emphasised just how critical early years learning is when we come to both opportunities for children and also enabling parents to participate in economic activity. So we've tried new things. We've changed the way we've assumed it will always work. And that, of course, is always challenging. But going online has offered, which has been one of the critical differences in education delivery during that time, where children were able to learn from home if possible, again showed us the significance of the digital divide that has emerged from something that academics talk about to something that's in the everyday conversations about Australians and relationships to learning and indeed to the paid workforce. The importance of connectivity, the impacts of having a low income, of the kind of housing you're able to secure, the size of your family, where you live, your cultural relationship to internet and computer and digital based learning. All of these things shape how families and how learners relate to access to online opportunities. But one of the things that I've found emerging from a survey that we've done during the COVID period in May and June was that there might be opportunities for new forms of thinking about inclusion, particularly for those who have experienced the school environment as excluding or unsafe. So we took on a survey of parents and found that whilst half or just over said that their children's learning was in fact worse off under the COVID conditions, and around 1 in 5 said there was no real change, their children just adapted to it. But 23% interestingly said their children's learning was better during this period. And it opens questions about the affordances of online learning, not just as a fallback emergency, but a way of engagement. Now, this is of course a spectrum from those who find engagement with the screen difficult through to those who will spend their whole day on a screen if possible. So it raises questions about how we reimagine, I like that word from Professor Bateman's speech, that we can reimagine different forms of inclusion. We already have an infrastructure which enables people to have school support officers which adapt to their learning situation, but that's been not really translated into an online or blended mode of learning. And just as we found that some adults have expressed how much more productive and focused they've become in a home workplace, we need to think about how children have adapted as learners. And across the spectrum, what does that mean for those who've experienced going to school as, for example, something like bullying or feeling excluded, unable to relate, or being seen as dangerous and unsafe in the school environment. These children at the moment are disconnected from learning, but we need to find ways to support the new modes that have become available with COVID. So I'd like to see that, whilst acknowledging the losses and the challenges of COVID, that we have got opportunities to make change, to have a new range of options that can better support students' learning, and indeed that also figures a need to adapt teacher education more strongly to support online engagement with students as one of the strategies in the broad range of strategies and pedagogical expertise that educators bring to their environments. I think it also offers the opportunity to keep pushing the value of early childhood learning and the need for it to be better integrated into a national, universally accessible education system which extends down to 3-year-olds, enabling them to have consistent access to a better and more secure learning environment with ongoing funding and development and expertise. So I think coming to a consideration of COVID and its affordances, that we have shown how well we can adapt, how central the education and learning system in Australia is, and its centrality to the development of opportunities for our students in future. So I think we go into 2021 with more things to think about, more opportunities to develop new ways of doing things, and critically to think about how we can be using those to be more inclusive, particularly in the early years, and for those students who are having difficulty in maintaining presence at school and therefore often leave or are excluded before they've completed their education. So a lot to think about. I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Dr. Emily Berger from Monash University. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you as well. Just as everyone said, thank you for the opportunity, obviously, to present today and give you some insights or some food for thought about some of the work that's been happening at Monash University, but also acknowledging that there's been a great amount of work happening across other universities and by other researchers. And of course, as my colleagues have done, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the elders, both past and present, on which we meet today, and also to acknowledge any Indigenous peoples here today who are present today. I'm just introduce myself. I'm first and foremost an educational and developmental psychologist, and so really in my role as a psychologist, but as a researcher at Monash University, I really focus very strongly on inclusion and equity of young people and families from disadvantaged, trauma exposed and adverse backgrounds. And I really want to, I guess, provide some grounds to think about how COVID-19 can be considered, and the pandemic can be considered as a potentially traumatic and adverse experience for young people, and then by extension how that might impact or relate to learning outcomes for children and obviously their ongoing learning as well. So really thinking about COVID-19 and the pandemic as an ongoing threat. So it's something that has been with us for quite some time now. It's something that likely we'll need to keep on considering, and young people will be considering ongoing, as well as some of my colleagues have mentioned as well. So thinking about this ongoing threat and how we're coping and how young people are coping psychologically, but also in their learning as well. I also think in terms of that ongoing threat, I think about what Professor Andrew Martin said in terms of the depletion of energy, and I would very much mirror that as well, that perception as well, and view that there's a depletion of energy for learning, and you know, having a depletion of learning and a depletion of energy, obviously, you know, when there's already limited resources, and I can speak to some of those limited resources in families as well. So I'm going to speak more today about the short-term, but also the potential long-term consequences that we're finding through the literature around COVID-19, but also drawing on previous literature. So when we look at other pandemics that have happened around the world. And so in this, you know, in the interest of thinking about it as an ongoing threat and the depletion of energy, as Andrew said, you know, it definitely, children are experiencing reduced concentration, inattention, and reduced control of their emotions and their behaviour. And again, if they have depleted energy, one of the first things to drop off the table is their capacity to learn and engage in their education. The next thing to drop off the table is their emotion regulation and their ability to regulate their behaviours as well. So obviously there's a snowballing impact that can happen. So there is literature talking about young people experiencing anxiety, stress, post-traumatic distress reactions as well, and families experiencing that too. And it's important to keep in mind that there's a range of different risk factors that will obviously make a young person more likely to experience adverse psychological and learning outcomes as a result of the pandemic and the stressful year that we've all been through, young people included. And I can speak to some of those risk factors and things to consider, because obviously risk factors are important to consider so that we understand who we need to support, and I'll speak to how we can potentially support them, and really a call for action in terms of better mental health support and more mental health support, both within schools but also external in the community, so that we can support teachers better, that teachers have the capacity to notice and refer young people, but also that obviously young people can get the support when they need it. So as I said, there's a range of impacts that are happening for children and families because of the pandemic. Also acknowledging as well that there's young people who have shown great resilience and growth during this time. So I think it's important for teachers and for us as well to acknowledge that there's both sides of the coin, and we can't forget about the children that have grown and learned a lot about themselves and their capacity to cope and develop great agency in their capacity to cope, but also those children most at risk. When talking about those most at risk, as I said, it's really, you know, it mirrors what we see in the wider trauma literature. So thinking about COVID-19, similar to how we think about other traumatic experiences, things such as parents who have a mental illness, increased family violence, how children are thinking about the event as well. So sometimes it can be exposure to the pandemic, having someone in your family who has contracted COVID-19, but it's also about children and how they watch the media, for example, and how they take in those messages, and the subjective interpretations of those sorts of messages that they're getting from the media or from family as well, and children interpreting those in either a really productive way or a non-productive way. So as I said, you know, that increased family violence as well, increasing those risks. And I really just want to conclude, I guess, what I'm talking about today. I really want to conclude on a call to action in relation to greater use of trauma-informed practice approaches, really to help educators, but also to help the young people themselves as well, to be able to link young people in with services, but greater resourcing of mental health services, greater research, greater funding around mental health services, so that we can continue to respond to this mental health impact and the ongoing threat that is COVID-19. I think my time is up, and as I said, it was lovely to have the opportunity to present today. I'm going to throw it back to Sharon, who's going to convene our panel discussion. So Shannon, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the panel for your contributions today. As I said, there is an opportunity for others to ask questions, and if you do wish to, if you could just flag in the chat box that you want to ask a question. We have had one question already, well actually we've had two questions already come through. One to put to the whole panel is, would it be useful in normal years, whatever normal years look like going forward from here, would it be useful in normal years if we included occasional school from home days this year, like we practice other aspects of schooling? We practice evacuations, we practice evacuations. Would it be useful practicing schooling from home at other times in the year, so that if something like this does occur in the future, children are more able to adapt to that?
I'll agree that it's a good question, because I think having practice and being familiar with something makes it more or less stressful. And so we also need to be developing our skills about what works for different students. Different students will carry a bag of different histories and impacts and how they relate to their schooling environment. So rather than, again, having it necessarily a mass declaration, I'd like it to become a more normalised option, just as we have done so with webinars and seminars and the joys of coming together to share information and discussion. We've become adapted to, and Zoom has become a verb. So keeping in touch with that as a normal option in the range of opportunities, I think, has a lot of affordances, because different students at different times might particularly need to be in a home environment to be able to get on with learning, and others might definitely need the opportunity to be part of that school community in person. So I just would like it to become part of a normal, integrated part of the spectrum of learning and teaching and learning modes.
I'd also like to just jump in there and just a couple of comments, that it's not always about a rehearsal. It's about imagining different ways, or reimagining how we work. And maybe it's not always about thinking about working from home or learning from home. Not all homes are the same. Not all homes have the same infrastructure. So it's also about thinking about that idea of accessibility for education for all, wherever you are, however you are, whoever you are, and what that looks like outside of the traditional way that we structure schooling. Because we don't know what we're rehearsing for next. That's the idea of, unknown futures. So to really have that explicit kind of engagement of multimodal learning and, more creative kind of engagement, I think is a challenge for us to think about as educators, moving beyond here. We've had an awakening, and so it's time for us to respond.
Great, thank you. This is a question probably more to Emily and Andrew, and coming off the back of what you said, but Deb and Elspeth, you may have contributions here as well. We've talked a lot about the impacts on parents and on students and on systems. And Emily, you spoke about the impacts for teachers having to identify psychological support that's needed for students. What can we be doing better for teachers? Teachers have had to adapt ridiculously quickly this year. They are drawing on basically their personal knowledge rather than necessarily their training, because we haven't trained for, you're going to be delivering in multiple different formats this year. Andrew spoke about surge depletion, or I think you called it the depletion of the ego, Andrew. How do we help teachers with that? How do systems help teachers with that?
Yeah, for me, I'm happy to sort of speak about this a little bit. So we've done a little bit of research as well, looking at the impact on educators, and the impact on educators is all the things you've just mentioned and more. You know, but to put it bluntly, it has had a great impact on educators. I spoke briefly about trauma-informed practice, because, as I said, there is a link between the impacts we're seeing from the pandemic and the impacts that we're seeing in relation to other traumatic experiences, such as a disaster event, for example. And I always like to say, I work very strongly in this area, and I always like to say that trauma-informed practice, I like to think about it as being more about the educator and the teacher than about the young people. Yes, it is about young people. It is about ensuring that they're noticed and that they're referred when they need support. But it's also about educators and giving them the skills and knowledge and strategies while being supported by other members of staff as well in that role, including school leadership as well. Obviously, we need to speak about school leadership. And part of that idea of trauma-informed practice is about defining roles so that we're preventing burnout or attempting to prevent burnout among educators. So they're really crystal clear. What is my role in this situation? And I think because of COVID-19 and because we haven't been prepared, we didn't know. We didn't know what the role was of the educator, what was the role of school leadership. You know, schools were trying to make it up as they went along, as a lot of us were, even at a tertiary level, you know, with our online learning, sort of making it up as we go along. So I would like to see more, as we've all spoken about, more proactive education support, systems-based approaches as well, that it's a top-down approach from school leadership coming down.
Great, thanks, Emily. Andrew, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, actually, I'll bounce off the previous question to answer the second question. And so I think, I mean, there's a lot of logistics involved in having a day at home, a week or whatever, that you know, in terms of parental arrangements, kids that actually are better off at school most of the week, and all that sort of stuff. But what is clear is that online learning is critical. And that's not negotiable and will be a major presence going forward. And so that needs attention. And maybe if that, to the extent that that gets proper professional learning for teachers, proper resourcing going forward, then there will be less of a need to practice a day a week being at home. Because my observation of the greatest stress on teachers this year was how they had to so quickly move from real-time physical instruction to a mode of learning, adapting not only their instruction, their communication modes, but also their resourcing, their materials, their assessments. And so that was an enormous stress on teachers, and hats off to them for doing it. But we should not be in this position again now, because we now know we need to invest significant professional learning time to helping teachers and showing them how to develop remote learning procedures and practices, materials and assessments. And so if we can in 2021 attend to that, then I think we take a lot of stress off their plates if and when the time comes kids have to go back home and learn remotely. And also it may reduce the need for you know, rehearsals on the chance that you know, if a pandemic or similar was to happen again. So yeah, I think that's how you can take a lot of stress off teachers' plates. Really good resourcing, support and professional learning to get that online learning and instruction as well as they can.
Fantastic, thank you. Sorry, drawing off the back of that question, and you've covered it a bit in those answers, but that's sort of talking about the continued learning that teachers who are already in practice go through. What could we be doing in teacher training before teachers actually are in the classrooms? What can we be incorporating in the way that we are teaching our student teachers to adapt in these ways? What learnings might we have from there? And I think, Deb, you might have some interesting things to say on this one.
I think this is a very exciting time for teacher education. And I think that one of the things I talked about earlier was how do we raise the esteem and the profession to attract diverse teachers from all kinds of communities. In terms of certainly at Flinders, we're completely renewing our approach to teacher education. Instead of necessarily bundling up the traditional kind of ways of thinking about preparing our teachers for a very rapidly changing profession, it's kind of the blend of that content rigor that we want our teachers to be able to have. It's about understanding learner diversity and the very ranging contexts that our learners come from. It's about understanding the families that they come from. It's about understanding the different modalities of how we teach and how we make learning accessible for our students. And it's about becoming much more integrated with the other community services and agencies. So Emily talked before about this idea of referral, and one of the things that has been very challenging, I think, in the past is that many of our social structures have worked in isolation and quite separately. So what might it look like to reimagine, a much more community kind of school-based approach that brings resources to where they need to be, because teachers are increasingly put upon to have much broader areas of expertise, and we have to be very clear on what the role of teachers and educational leaders are, and then how those other services and supports are able to lean in to where they need to lean in and offer support. And I think these are the opportunities that we have right now in this time to think much more bravely, much more boldly, much more excitedly about all of these things. This is a very exciting time for education.
Thanks, Deb. We've had another question come through asking whether public systems should be investing more in IT and technology for use in the home, given the inequalities that have been exposed through the pandemic. Elspeth, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, and I'd make the point that it's not necessarily only about devices. There's connectivity. Are you in a location which is able to receive a signal? How reliable are those services? It can be about the kind of housing that you're able to access and the security of that housing. If you're homeless or you're in precarious housing, again, you're not going to be able to afford the connectivity. How many children there are there disabilities in play in terms of relationship to devices? Is there a cultural background of support for ability to engage with those devices? So it is more complex than just a tablet being given to students, although there's certainly an indication that certainly in low-income households, certainly where there's a larger number of children, affording a device for each child is actually what's needed for online access as a platform to enter the classroom, but it's not necessarily enough. And so it is about the complexities, and I would note that when the job seeker payment basically doubled the income support levels, people spoke about being able to eat and to drink and put food on the table consistently and buy clothes and shoes for their children. We need to ensure that households have sufficient to meet basic needs, and connectivity is emerging as something that needs to be understood as part of the ordinary social infrastructure available to all citizens, including children. So it is a shift in thinking to see it's more than simply a device. It's much more about the social circumstances and the ability to sustain a participation with that income level. And when the decision comes, what are we going to do with job seeker levels going forwards? The government has to understand that.
Thank you. Well, I'm very conscious of the time and we have come to the end of our session. Thank you very much to all of our panellists for joining in today. For those in attendance, we have made a recording of this, which will be made available if you want to go back and have a look at it. For any journalists who wish to get in contact with our experts, please do. I'm sure they will all have a lot more to say on this topic. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and I wish you all a happy and safe Christmas. Thank you.